Robert never thought much about checking his voicemail. In this age of text messages and social media, who did? The small red notification bubble on his phone screen had been there for 3 days now. 3 days since his mom had called while he was in that important meeting with his boss. 3 days of him telling himself he'd call her back when things settled down a bit. Life in the city moved at a relentless pace. As a junior architect at a prestigious firm, Robert barely had time to breathe between deadlines and client meetings. His apartment, a cramped studio 20 floors up, overlooked the sprawling metropolis he'd dreamed of conquering since childhood. The view was worth the ridiculous rent, at least that's what he told himself on nights when he'd collapse on his sofa, too tired to even make it to his bed. "I'll call Mom tomorrow," he muttered to himself as he scrolled through emails at 11 p.m. The glow of his laptop screen cast harsh shadows across his tired face. His phone sat face down on the coffee table, that unheard voicemail waiting patiently like his mother always did. Robert's relationship with his mom had always been complicated. She'd raised him alone after his father walked out when he was just 4 years old. Growing up in their small town, he'd watched her work 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. She never complained, not once. Even when her hands were cracked and bleeding from cleaning houses all day, she'd still find the energy to help him with his homework or listen to his dreams about designing buildings that touched the sky. "You're going places, Bobby," she would say, using the nickname he pretended to hate but secretly loved. "Don't you worry about me. You just focus on those dreams of yours." And he had. A scholarship to a good university, internships every summer, and now this job that demanded everything from him. The distance between them had grown, not just in miles but in the spaces between their phone calls. Once weekly calls became monthly, and those monthly calls sometimes slipped through the cracks of his busy schedule. The morning after ignoring her voicemail yet again, Robert rushed to work with a takeout coffee in hand. The subway was packed as usual, bodies pressed against each other in uncomfortable silence. A heavy rain lashed against the windows of the train, matching his gloomy mood. He hadn't slept well, dreams filled with half-remembered conversations and his mother's voice calling his name from somewhere he couldn't reach. At work, his day spiraled into chaos. Their biggest client was unhappy with the latest designs, his boss was breathing down his neck, and his coworker Ling was out sick, leaving Robert to handle her workload too. "Can you believe this?" Robert vented to his friend David during their quick lunch break. "I'm drowning here. Chen wants the revisions by tomorrow morning, and I haven't even started on the Roberts project." David nodded sympathetically while checking his own phone. "That's rough, man. Hey, didn't you say your mom was trying to reach you?" Robert waved his hand dismissively. "Yeah, probably just checking in. You know how moms are. I'll call her this weekend when things calm down." But things never calmed down, did they? That was the lie he told himself every week. There would always be another deadline, another meeting, another excuse. The rain continued throughout the day, turning the city gray and washing away the usual sounds of traffic and pedestrians. By the time Robert left the office, it was already dark. The neon signs reflected in puddles along the sidewalk as he trudged back to the subway station, his shoulders hunched against the downpour. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Fishing it out, he expected to see his boss's name, probably with some last-minute request that couldn't wait until morning. Instead, an unknown number lit up his screen. Robert hesitated before answering. "Hello? Robert?" A woman's voice, vaguely familiar but not his mother's. "This is Judy, your mom's neighbor." Something in her tone made him stop walking. People streamed around him on the crowded sidewalk, annoyed at the sudden obstacle, but Robert didn't notice them. "Is everything okay?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. A cold feeling spread through his chest, making it hard to breathe. "I'm so sorry, Robert. I've been trying to reach you. Your mother, she The rest of Judy's words faded into the background noise of the city. Robert stood frozen in the rain, his world suddenly tilting on its axis. All he could think about was that unheard voicemail, sitting in his phone like an accusation. What had she wanted to tell him? What had she needed? Later that night, sitting in his darkened apartment with tears streaming down his face, Robert finally pressed play on that voicemail. His mother's voice, slightly breathless but warm as always, filled the empty space around him. "Bobby, it's Mom. I know you're busy with your important job, but I needed to talk to you about something. The doctor called today with my test results." As her words continued, Robert's heart shattered into a million pieces. If only he had listened sooner. If only he had picked up the phone when she called. If only he hadn't been too busy for the woman who had never once been too busy for him. Some mistakes, he was learning in the most painful way possible, you never get the chance to fix. The flight back to his hometown felt endless. Robert sat by the window, watching clouds drift beneath the plane, his mother's voicemail playing on repeat in his mind. Her voice had been calm, almost apologetic as she explained about the cancer diagnosis. Stage 4. Already spread to her liver. The doctors had given her months, not years. "I didn't want to worry you, Bobby," she had said in that message he'd ignored for days. "But I thought you should know. Maybe you could come visit soon. No rush, I know how important your job is. I love you. No rush." Those words crushed him now. She'd been protecting him until the very end, downplaying her pain so he wouldn't feel obligated to drop everything and come home. And he had taken advantage of that selflessness without even realizing it. When the plane landed, Robert rented a car and drove through familiar streets that somehow looked different now. The small town where he'd grown up hadn't changed much, the same diner on the corner, the park where he'd played as a child, the high school where he'd dreamed of escape. But everything felt hollow, as if the heart had been ripped out of the place. Or maybe that was just his own heart he was missing. Judy was waiting on the porch of his mother's modest one-story house. She was older than Robert remembered, her hair now completely gray, her face lined with grief. When she hugged him, he caught the scent of his mother's favorite lavender soap. "She talked about you constantly," Judy said as she led him inside. So proud of her big city architect son. The house was exactly as he remembered, neat and simple with faded floral curtains his mother had sewn herself. Family photos lined the walls, Robert's graduation, his first day of kindergarten, a rare picture of both of them at the beach when he was 10. His mother's smile was radiant in every image. When did she? Robert couldn't finish the question. "Tuesday evening," Judy said gently. "In her sleep. The hospice nurse said she wasn't in pain." Tuesday. The day she had left him that voicemail. The day he'd been too busy with that client meeting to answer her call. He'd been presenting floor plans while his mother had been taking her last breaths. "She left some things for you," Judy continued, gesturing to a small box on the coffee table. "And there are arrangements to discuss. The funeral home has been waiting for you to arrive." The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet, devastating moments. Robert found himself moving through his childhood home like a ghost, touching his mother's things, breathing in her fading scent. In her bedroom, her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand next to a half-finished novel. A grocery list in her handwriting was stuck to the refrigerator. Evidence of a life interrupted. The box Judy had mentioned contained letters, dozens of them, all addressed to him, all unopened. His mother had written them over the years since he'd moved away but never mailed them. Some were dated from his college days, others from just weeks before her death. Sitting on the floor of his old bedroom, Robert opened the first one with trembling hands. "My dearest Bobby," it began. "Today was your first day at university. I dropped you off and managed not to cry until I got back to the car. I'm so proud of you I could burst. Letter after letter revealed the life of a woman who had lived for her son, who had celebrated his every success from afar, who had longed for more connection but never demanded it. She wrote about her garden, her book club, her part-time job at the library after her cleaning work became too physically demanding. She wrote about missing him, about understanding his busy life, about her hopes for his happiness. And in the final letter, dated just a month ago, she wrote about her diagnosis. "I've known something was wrong for a while," she admitted in her careful handwriting, now slightly shakier than in the earlier letters. "But I didn't want to worry you. The doctors say it's advanced, and I've decided not to pursue aggressive treatment. Quality over quantity, that's what I told them. I hope you'll understand." Robert broke down then, curled on his childhood bedroom floor, surrounded by the evidence of his mother's unwavering love and his own negligence. How many times had he been too busy to call? How many holidays had he missed because of work deadlines? How many chances had he wasted? The funeral was small but well attended. It seemed everyone in town had a story about his mother, how she'd volunteered at the food bank despite barely making ends meet herself, how she'd knitted hats for newborns at the local hospital, how she'd always had a kind word for everyone she met. "Your mom was the real deal," said Mr. Patterson, Robert's high school math teacher. "Salt of the earth. Never complained, even when life got rough." A young woman Robert didn't recognize approached him after the service. "Your mom helped me get my GED last year," she explained, wiping away tears. "She tutored me for free at the library. Said everyone deserves a second chance." Second chances. Robert wondered if he deserved one after failing his mother so completely. That night, alone in her house, Robert found himself listening to that voicemail one more time. Her voice filled the empty rooms, bringing her presence back for just a moment. "And Bobby," she said at the end of the message, after explaining about her diagnosis, "please don't blame yourself for anything. You were the best thing in my life. Always remember that." But how could he not blame himself? How could he forgive the years of neglect, the missed calls, the empty promises to visit? How could he live with knowing that while he was chasing success in the city, his mother had been facing death alone? As dawn broke over his hometown, Robert made a decision. He couldn't change the past, couldn't reclaim those lost moments with his mother. But perhaps he could honor her memory by living differently from now on. Perhaps her last words didn't have to be just a reminder of his failure, but a catalyst for change. With shaking hands, he dialed his boss's number. The conversation with his boss went exactly as Robert expected. There was initial sympathy, of course, obligatory condolences offered in that professionally detached tone that corporate America had perfected. But when Robert explained that he needed more time off, possibly a month or two to settle his mother's affairs, the sympathy quickly evaporated. "I understand this is difficult, Robert," his boss said, his voice hardening, "but the Chin project is at a critical stage. The team needs you. We've already been more than accommodating with the bereavement leave. 3 days. That's what the company considered accommodating for the loss of a parent. 72 hours to process a lifetime of memories and regrets." "I'm sorry," Robert said, surprising himself with how calm he sounded. "But I need to do this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You understand what you're risking here, don't you? Your position, the promotion we discussed." A week ago, those words would have sent Robert into a panic. His career had been everything, the validation he'd craved, the success he'd prioritized above all else. But now, sitting in his mother's kitchen where she'd made countless meals for him, where she'd helped him with homework and listened to his dreams, those things seemed hollow. "I understand," Robert replied. "I'll send in my formal resignation letter today." After hanging up, he expected to feel regret or at least anxiety about what he'd just done. Instead, a strange sense of peace washed over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe fully. The next few weeks were consumed with the practicalities of death. Robert sorted through his mother's modest possessions, paid her outstanding bills, met with her lawyer about her simple will. She had left everything to him: the house, her old car, a small life insurance policy that would barely cover the funeral expenses, and a savings account with just enough to get by for a few months if he was careful. Each item he touched held memories. The chipped blue teapot she'd used every morning. The worn armchair where she'd sat to read, a blanket always draped over the side in case she got cold. The garden tools in the shed out back, still caked with dirt from her last day working among her beloved flowers. Robert found himself wandering from room to room, sometimes sitting for hours just remembering. The house creaked and settled around him, as if it too was adjusting to her absence. At night, he slept in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by old sports trophies and science fair ribbons his mother had proudly displayed. It was during one of these nights, unable to sleep and scrolling mindlessly through old photos on his phone, that Robert found it, another voicemail from his mother, this one from nearly 6 months ago. How had he missed it? How many of her calls had he ignored or forgotten to return? His finger hovered over the play button. Part of him was afraid to listen, afraid of what this message might contain, afraid of how much more guilt it might add to the mountain he was already carrying. But he pressed play anyway. "Bobby, it's Mom." Her voice sounded stronger in this recording, and something in Robert's chest tightened at the realization that this was before the cancer had really taken hold. "I was just thinking about you and wanted to hear your voice. Nothing important, just your old mom being silly. Call me when you can. Love you." Nothing important. But it was everything. Just her, reaching out across the miles because she was thinking about him. No demands, no guilt trips, just love. How many of these casual check-ins had he ignored or rushed through? How many times had he cut their conversations short because he had work to do or plans with friends? The next morning, Robert found himself driving to the local hospice center where his mother had spent her final days. The nurse at the reception desk recognized him from the few visits he'd managed to make after flying home when Judy had finally reached him. "Mrs. Patel's son," she said with a gentle smile. "She talked about you all the time." The guilt stabbed at him again. "I was hoping to speak with someone about volunteer opportunities," he said. The surprise on her face was evident, but she quickly recovered. "Of course. Let me get our volunteer coordinator for you." An hour later, Robert walked out with an application form and a schedule for orientation sessions. It wasn't a grand gesture or a complete life overhaul, but it was a start, a small way to honor his mother by giving some of his time to others who were facing what she had faced, often alone. Back at the house, Robert sat at his mother's small desk by the window that overlooked her garden. Spring was coming, and tender green shoots were already pushing through the soil where she had planted bulbs last fall. Life continuing despite everything. He opened his laptop and, for the first time in weeks, checked his emails. Hundreds of unread messages, most from work, some from friends wondering where he'd disappeared to. One from Ling, his co-worker, expressing genuine concern and offering help if he needed it. Robert started typing a response to her, trying to explain what had happened, and not just with his mother's death but with his own realization about the life he'd been living. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush as he poured out everything: the ignored voicemails, the unread letters, the years of putting his career before the one person who had always put him first. "I don't know what I'm doing next," he wrote honestly. "I just know I can't go back to living the way I was before." As he typed, Robert noticed a small wooden box pushed to the back of the desk drawer he'd opened looking for stationery. Inside was a journal bound in faded green fabric. His mother's handwriting filled the pages, not letters to him this time, but her private thoughts and daily observations. He hesitated, feeling like an intruder. These weren't meant for him, weren't carefully composed messages she'd chosen to share. But something compelled him to turn the pages, to seek understanding of who his mother really was beyond just being his mother. The first entry was dated nearly 30 years ago: just after his father had left them. "Today, I held my son and promised him that everything would be okay," she had written. "I don't know if that's true, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it so." And she had. Every sacrifice, every long day of work, every dream she'd set aside, all of it had been to keep that promise to a frightened 4-year-old boy. Robert closed the journal, unable to read more through his tears. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across his mother's garden. In that moment, he made a promise of his own. Days turned into weeks. Spring bloomed fully in his mother's garden, bringing with it riots of color, daffodils, tulips, and hyacinths she had planted with her own hands last fall, knowing she might never see them flower. Robert found himself spending hours tending to them, learning as he went, guided by gardening books she had marked with notes in the margins. "Talk to them," one of her scribbled notes read. "Plants know when they're loved." So he did, feeling foolish at first, then finding an unexpected comfort in it. He told the flowers about his day, about his memories of her, about his confusion over what to do next with his life. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between words, he could almost hear her answering. Volunteering at the hospice center twice a week became the anchor of his schedule. At first, the staff had been wary. Family members often volunteered in the immediate aftermath of loss, driven by grief and guilt, only to disappear when those initial emotions faded. But Robert kept showing up, making coffee for visitors, sitting with patients who had no one else, running errands for the overworked nurses. "You've got your mother's touch," one of the older nurses told him after watching him patiently help a frustrated patient with her lunch. She was the same way, gentle but persistent. It was the highest compliment anyone could have given him, though it stung with the knowledge that he had never truly appreciated that quality in her when she was alive. In the evenings, Robert continued reading his mother's journals, working his way through decades of her life. He learned things about her he had never known, dreams she'd had beyond motherhood, challenges she'd faced that she'd kept from him, moments of joy and deep sadness she'd experienced. "Bobby got accepted to the university today," she'd written years ago. "Full scholarship. I've never been so proud or so heartbroken all at once. He'll be leaving soon, heading toward the future he deserves. I'll miss him every day, but this is what I've worked for, to give him wings strong enough to fly away." That entry left him sobbing on the living room floor, clutching the journal to his chest. She had wanted him to fly, had sacrificed everything to make it possible, and then watched him soar so far away that he rarely looked back. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through a box of financial documents, Robert found a folder labeled Bobby's House Fund. Inside were bank statements showing small, regular deposits over the course of 20 years, $10 here, $25 there, occasionally larger amounts when she must have worked extra shifts. The final total was just over $15,000. A note in her handwriting explained, "For the down payment on your first house. I know you're doing well on your own, but every little bit helps, and this way I get to be part of your new beginning." She had been saving for him even as she lived paycheck to paycheck, even as she put off replacing her leaking roof, even as she worked long past when her health began to fail. That discovery changed something in Robert. The weight of guilt that had been crushing him began to shift, not disappearing but transforming into something else, a determination to live a life worthy of her sacrifice. He called Judy, his mother's neighbor, and asked her to meet him for coffee at the local diner. They sat in a booth by the window, rain streaking the glass and casting watercolor patterns on the worn formica table. "I need to ask you something," Robert said after they had exchanged pleasantries. "And I need you to be completely honest with me." Judy nodded, wrapping her weathered hands around her coffee mug. "Do you think my mom was happy? I mean, genuinely happy with her life?" The question had been haunting him since finding her journals, the entries full of love and optimism, but also occasional loneliness and deferred dreams. Judy considered the question for a long moment. "I think happiness isn't quite the right word," she finally said. "Your mom had purpose. Everything she did, from the extra shifts to the volunteer work at the library, it all had meaning to her. That's something a lot of people never find. Because of me, Robert said, the familiar guilt rising again. She gave up everything for me. No, Judy said firmly, reaching across the table to pat his hand. Not for you. Through you. There's a difference. Seeing his confusion, she continued, your mother chose her path, Robert. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She built the life she wanted, one centered on love. On the drive back to his mother's house, his house now, he supposed, though it still didn't feel that way, Robert let Judy's words sink in. Had he been thinking about this all wrong? Was his guilt just another form of selfishness, centering himself in his mother's story rather than seeing her as the author of her own life? He pulled into the driveway as his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ling, his former coworker. In town for a client meeting tomorrow. Heard you're still here. Coffee? Robert hesitated. He had been avoiding contact with most people from his old life, unsure how to explain the changes he was going through, the shifting of his priorities and perspective. But Ling had always been different, more grounded, less caught up in the corporate ladder climbing that had consumed him. Sure, he texted back. The diner on Main at 10? That night, Robert sat on the porch swing his mother had loved, listening to the rain and watching the darkness settle over the neighborhood. For the first time since her death, he felt a tentative peace. Not happiness, not yet, but perhaps what Judy had described, a sense of purpose beginning to take root. He pulled out his phone and, almost without thinking, played his mother's voicemail again. Her voice, weaker than in the earlier message but still warm, still essentially her, filled the quiet evening air. Bobby, it's Mom. I know you're busy with your important job, but I needed to talk to you about something. The doctor called today with my test results. This time, instead of stopping the message halfway through as he usually did, overwhelmed by grief and regret, he let it play to the end. And Bobby, her voice continued after explaining about her diagnosis, please don't blame yourself for anything. You were the best thing in my life. Always remember that. I'm so proud of the man you've become. I love you, sweetheart. The man she thought he had become. Not the one who had ignored her calls and forgotten birthdays, but someone worthy of her pride. Someone who had yet to exist, perhaps, but whom Robert now felt determined to become. He played the message one more time before going inside, letting her love wash over him like a benediction. The diner hadn't changed in the 15 years since Robert had been a regular. The same red vinyl booths, slightly cracked with age. The same collection of local sports team pennants on the walls. Even Dottie, the owner's wife, was still working the counter, her hair now completely silver but her smile just as warm. Little Bobby Thompson, she exclaimed when she spotted him. Though I guess not so little anymore. Robert smiled, accepting her tight hug. Hi, Dottie. Table for two, please. I'm meeting a friend. She led him to a booth by the window, the same one where he and his mother used to sit every Sunday after church. It had been their special ritual, pancakes for him, coffee and toast for her, and conversations that ranged from his schoolwork to his dreams of designing buildings in faraway cities. Your usual? Dottie asked with a wink, as if no time had passed. You remember? Chocolate chip pancakes, extra whipped cream, side of bacon. Some things stick with you. She patted his shoulder. Your mama used to say you'd outgrow the sweet tooth, but she doubted you'd ever outgrow that big heart of yours. The comment caught him off guard, a sharp contrast to how he'd been viewing himself lately, selfish, neglectful, unworthy of his mother's devotion. Had she really seen him that way? A big heart? Before he could respond, the bell above the door jingled, and Ling walked in. She spotted him immediately, her face lighting up with a genuine smile. In her smart business suit and practical heels, she looked like she belonged to a different world than this small-town diner, the world Robert had left behind. "Robert." She hurried over, hesitating briefly before giving him a quick hug. "It's so good to see you." They settled into the booth as Dottie brought coffee without being asked. The familiar routine of a place where everyone knew everyone else, something Robert had once found suffocating but now found oddly comforting. "So," Ling said after they'd ordered, studying his face carefully, "how are you?" "Really?" It was a simple question, one he'd been asked dozens of times since his mother's death, usually requiring nothing more than the standard "I'm hanging in there" response. But Ling's direct gaze demanded honesty. "I'm changing," he said finally. "Everything is changing." And then, surprising himself, he told her everything, about the voicemails and the letters, about quitting his job and volunteering at the hospice, about the garden and his mother's journals and the house fund she'd been keeping for him all these years. Ling listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or reaching across the table to squeeze his hand during the difficult parts. When he finally fell silent, their food long since delivered and growing cold, she took a sip of her coffee before responding. "You know what I always admired about you, Robert?" she asked. "Your focus. When you were working on a project, nothing else existed. You could tune out every distraction. It didn't feel like a compliment anymore." "Yeah, including the people who mattered most." "Maybe," she acknowledged. "But that same quality, that ability to be fully present in what you're doing, I see it now too. You're just focusing on different things." Her observation startled him. He hadn't thought of it that way, that the intensity he'd once directed toward his career was now being channeled into understanding his mother's life and reshaping his own. "The office isn't the same without you," Ling continued. "Chen keeps asking when you're coming back." Robert shook his head. "I'm not. At least, not there. Not to that life. I figured." She smiled slightly. "So what's next then?" It was the question he'd been avoiding for weeks. What came after grief? After regret? After the slow dismantling of the life he'd built and the careful examination of the one he'd left behind? "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I'm starting to think maybe I should use what I learned there and do something different with it." Ling nodded encouragingly. "Like what?" "My mom saved for years so I could buy a house someday." The idea was still forming as he spoke it. "But this town doesn't have an architect. People here drive an hour to the city if they want to build something or renovate." "Small-town architect?" Ling raised an eyebrow. "Not exactly the prestigious career you were aiming for." "No," Robert agreed. "But maybe that was never what I really wanted. Maybe I was just chasing some idea of success that doesn't actually matter." After Ling left for her meeting, promising to keep in touch, Robert walked through the town he'd been so eager to escape as a teenager. He passed the library where his mother had worked part-time, the elementary school where she'd volunteered to read to children, the community center where she'd helped organize food drives during the holidays. Everywhere he went, people greeted him by name, offered condolences, shared stories about his mother. She had woven herself into the fabric of this community in ways he was only now beginning to understand. Her life, which he had sometimes pitied for its smallness, had been rich with connections and purpose. Back at the house, Robert found himself drawn to his old bedroom closet. Pushing aside clothes and boxes, he pulled out the drafting table his mother had given him for his 16th birthday, a significant expense for her at the time, but one she'd insisted on when his high school art teacher had mentioned his talent for technical drawing. The table was dusty but otherwise in perfect condition. Robert ran his hands over the smooth surface, remembering the hours he'd spent at it, sketching building designs and dreaming of the future. His mother would bring him snacks, peek over his shoulder, and marvel at his creations even when they were nothing more than rough outlines. "You're building worlds on that paper," she'd told him once. Just imagine what you'll do with the real thing someday. He'd imagined skyscrapers and museums, high-rises and corporate headquarters. Never once had he considered that the real thing might be here, designing additions for growing families, renovating historic buildings on Main Street, creating spaces that served the community his mother had loved. That evening, Robert cleaned off the drafting table and set it up by the window overlooking the garden. From the attic, he retrieved his old supplies, pencils, rulers, templates, many of them gifts from his mother who had encouraged his passion long before he understood where it might lead. As sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Robert began to sketch. Not a towering city building this time, but a simple pavilion for the park where the community held its summer concerts. His mother had always spread a blanket on the grass, even as her arthritis made it difficult for her to get up and down. How much more would she have enjoyed those evenings with proper seating, shelter from occasional rain, better acoustics? The design flowed easily, informed by both his professional training and his newfound understanding of what really mattered in a space meant for people to gather. In his mind's eye, he could see families like his own, single parents with children, elderly couples, teenagers on first dates, all finding a place within the structure he was creating. For the first time in months, Robert felt the spark of genuine excitement. This wasn't the career he had planned, but perhaps it was the one he was meant for all along. As darkness fell, Robert reached for his phone and once again played his mother's last voicemail. But this time, instead of stopping at her diagnosis or crying at her final, "I love you," he focused on the middle part, the words he'd previously skimmed past in his grief. "I know you're making a difference out there with your buildings," she had said. "Creating spaces for people to live and work and be happy in. That's a special kind of gift, Bobby. You're using it in the big city now, but remember, beautiful spaces matter everywhere." It was as if, even then, even in her final message, she had been guiding him toward this moment of realization. The community center meeting room buzzed with conversation. Robert stood nervously at the front, his designs mounted on foam boards propped on easels. When Mayor Wilson called the room to attention, the chatter gradually subsided, and all eyes turned toward him. "Most of you know Robert Thompson," the mayor began. "Nancy's boy. He's come home and has something he'd like to present to the town council tonight." Robert wiped his damp palms on his pants. This wasn't like his sleek presentations to corporate clients in air-conditioned boardrooms. This was personal, vulnerable in a way his city career had never been. These people had known him since childhood, had watched him grow up, had supported his mother when he'd left. "Thank you, Mayor Wilson." Robert cleared his throat. "As many of you know, I've been back in town for about 3 months now, following my mother's passing." Sympathetic nods rippled through the audience. "During this time, I've been reconnecting with the community that raised me. And I've realized something my mother always knew, that this town has a special kind of magic to it, but also some unaddressed needs." He moved to the first board, which showed his designs for the park pavilion. This would provide cover for summer concerts, a proper stage for performances, and accessible seating for everyone, including our elderly residents and those with mobility issues. The next board showed plans for renovating the community center itself, with an expanded food pantry, better kitchen facilities for community meals, and a dedicated space for after-school programs. "And this," he said, moving to the third board, "is a concept for affordable senior housing on the empty lot behind the library. Single-level homes designed specifically for aging in place, with a community garden at the center." The room was silent as he explained each project, detailing how they could be built in phases, using local contractors, with grants he'd already researched to offset costs. "I know I left this town as quickly as I could after high school," Robert concluded, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I thought success meant tall buildings and big cities. But being home these past months has shown me that the most meaningful architecture isn't about how high you build, but about how well you serve the people who will use the space. When he finished, the silence stretched for several seconds before Mrs. Abernathy, his former English teacher, spoke up. "Nancy would be so proud," she said simply, and the room erupted in applause. The council voted unanimously to pursue the pavilion project first, with Robert named as the official architect. As people crowded around to congratulate him afterward, he felt a strange sensation in his chest, a lightness he hadn't experienced since before his mother's death. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but purpose. Just as Judy had described. That night, Robert called David, his former friend from the city. They hadn't spoken since Robert's abrupt departure, their friendship having been primarily built around work and occasional drinks after long days at the office. "You did what?" David sounded incredulous after Robert explained his new path. "Pro bono design work for a town of what, 5,000 people?" 4,836 as of the last census, Robert corrected with a small smile. "And not everything's pro bono. I'm setting up a proper practice here. There's more work than you'd think. But your career, the Chin account, everything you worked for, wasn't making me happy," Robert finished for him. "Look, I know it sounds crazy from the outside. 3 months ago, I would have thought the same thing. But being here, reading my mom's journals, understanding the life she built, it's changed my perspective." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. They were living in different worlds now, with different measures of success. "Well, if it's what you want," David finally said, disbelief still evident in his tone. "Just don't close the door on coming back. Chen still asks about you." After they hung up, Robert sat on the porch swing, gently pushing back and forth as cicadas sang in the darkness. The conversation with David had clarified something important. He wasn't just taking a break or working through grief. He was choosing a fundamentally different path. The realization should have been terrifying, this complete divergence from the life he'd spent years building. Instead, it felt like coming home in more ways than one. The next morning, Robert woke early and drove to the cemetery. It was a beautiful spring day, the kind his mother had loved, with soft sunshine and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Her grave was still fresh, the ground not yet fully settled, but someone, Judy, probably, had planted marigolds around the simple headstone. Robert sat on the grass beside it, running his fingers over the engraved letters of her name. "I got the pavilion project, Mom," he said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish talking to stone and earth. "The town council approved it last night. Construction should start next month if all goes well." A butterfly landed briefly on the headstone, its wings orange and black against the gray granite, before fluttering away. "I've been listening to your voicemail every day," he continued. "Not just the last one, but all of them I saved over the years. There weren't many, I should have saved more. But even back then, you were trying to tell me what mattered." He pulled out his phone and played one from 3 years earlier, when he'd first been promoted at the firm. Her voice, stronger then, filled with pride but also gentle caution, "Don't forget to take time for yourself, Bobby. All that work won't keep you warm at night or hold your hand when you're sick. Trust your mama on this one." He hadn't listened then, had laughed off her concerns as old-fashioned thinking from someone who didn't understand the demands of his profession. Now, her words felt prophetic. "I'm trying to build something different now," he told her. "A life with meaning, like yours had. I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I'm trying." The breeze picked up, sending a shower of white petals from a nearby flowering tree across the cemetery. One landed on his knee, and Robert carefully picked it up, studying its delicate structure. His phone buzzed with a text message from Ling, "Got the transfer. Starting at the regional office next month. Coffee soon?" Robert smiled. After their diner meeting, Ling had mentioned the possibility of requesting a transfer to her firm's regional office, only an hour from his small town. He'd been surprised, she had always seemed as career-driven as he was, but she'd explained that the pandemic had changed her priorities too. "Life's too short to spend it all working," she'd said. "I want more balance. Maybe a garden of my own. Definitely fewer 60-hour weeks." He texted back, "Great news. Coffee and I'll throw in a tour of the pavilion site." Standing up, Robert placed his hand on top of his mother's headstone one last time. "I think you'd like Ling, Mom. She reminds me a little of you, smart, sees through my nonsense." As he walked back to his car, Robert felt that strange lightness again, now accompanied by something new, a tentative hope for the future. Not just a future defined by honoring his mother's memory, but one that might include new connections, new possibilities. He drove back into town, past the park where his pavilion would soon stand, past the diner where he now had breakfast most mornings, past the hospice where he still volunteered twice a week. This town that he had once been so desperate to escape now felt full of potential. Back at the house, his house now, he was finally beginning to accept. Robert settled at his drafting table to refine the pavilion plans based on feedback from the council meeting. As he worked, he played his mother's voicemails on speaker, letting her voice fill the room, no longer a source of pain but of inspiration. "Beautiful spaces matter everywhere," she had said. And now, he was beginning to truly understand what she meant. 1 year had passed since Robert had first listened to that final voicemail. A full cycle of seasons, spring's renewal, summer's abundance, autumn's contemplative beauty, and winter's quiet stillness. And now, spring again, bringing with it a sense of completion and new beginnings. The park pavilion was finished, its wooden beams and copper roof gleaming in the morning sunlight. Today was the dedication ceremony, and Robert stood off to the side, watching as people gathered, setting up folding chairs and arranging flowers on the stage he had designed. "Nervous?" Ling appeared beside him, looking beautiful in a simple sundress, her usual office attire replaced with something more suited to small-town celebrations. "A little," he admitted. "It's my first completed project here. I want it to be right for them." "For her," Ling corrected gently, taking his hand. "For her," he agreed. Their relationship had developed slowly over the past year, beginning with those coffee meetings and gradually deepening into something more meaningful. Ling had bought a small house at the edge of town, commuting to her job at the regional office, while Robert had transformed his mother's dining room into a proper architectural studio where he now ran his growing practice. The partnership worked better than either of them had expected. Both understood the demands of their professions but also the importance of balance, of making time for what truly mattered. Weekends were sacred, spent gardening or exploring nearby hiking trails or simply sitting on the porch swing, talking about everything and nothing. Mayor Wilson approached, interrupting Robert's thoughts. "It's time, son. People are ready." The dedication ceremony was brief but moving. The high school band played, somewhat off-key but with enthusiasm. The mayor gave a speech about community renewal. Mrs. Abernathy read a poem about gathering places. And then it was Robert's turn to speak. He stood at the microphone, looking out at the faces of people who had known him his entire life, alongside newer friends he'd made during the past year. In the front row sat Judy, his mother's faithful neighbor, and beside her, an empty chair with a single marigold, his mother's favorite flower, lying on the seat. "This pavilion," Robert began, his voice steady despite the emotion welling in his chest, "is dedicated to the memory of Nancy Thompson, my mother. But it's also dedicated to all of you, the community that shaped her life and, through her, shaped mine." He explained how the design incorporated elements that would make the space accessible and welcoming to everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest resident. How the acoustics were carefully planned to carry music throughout the park. How the roof was angled to collect rainwater for the community garden beds they'd installed nearby. "A year ago, I came back to this town broken by grief and regret," he continued, his voice softening. "I thought I was returning to deal with what had ended, my mother's life. Instead, I found myself discovering what never ended, her influence, her values, her love. As he spoke, a gentle breeze rustled through the new structure, causing the wind chimes that hung at each corner, his special addition to the design, to sing softly. His mother had always loved wind chimes, their random melody a reminder, she'd said, that beauty often comes from the unplanned moments. My mother used to tell me that beautiful spaces matter everywhere, Robert concluded. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I came home. Beauty isn't found in how impressive or expensive a building is. It's found in how it serves the people who use it, how it brings them together, how it becomes part of their stories. That's the kind of architecture I want to create here, not monuments to myself, but spaces that help this community thrive. The applause was warm and genuine, followed by a community picnic that stretched into the afternoon. As twilight approached, most people had gone home, leaving just a few stragglers enjoying the new space. An elderly couple slow danced to music only they could hear. A group of teenagers had claimed one corner, their laughter echoing under the wooden beams. A young mother rocked her baby on one of the benches Robert had designed with extra padding and perfect back support. "You did good, Bobby," came a voice behind him. Robert turned to find Mr. Patterson, his high school math teacher, now well into his 80s but still sharp-eyed behind thick glasses. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot. Your mother talked about you constantly, you know. Every achievement, every milestone. Carried your picture in her wallet and showed it to anyone who'd look." The old man chuckled. "Used to drive us all a bit crazy, but we understood. You were her world. And I didn't appreciate it enough while she was here," Robert said, the familiar regret surfacing despite all the healing of the past year. "Now, that's where you're wrong," Mr. Patterson said firmly. "Nancy knew exactly how much you loved her. She never doubted it for a second." "How can you be so sure?" "Because she told me so, not 2 weeks before she passed. We were at church, talking about you being so far away in the city. I asked if she wished you'd visit more, and you know what she said?" The old man's eyes twinkled with the memory. "My Bobby shows his love through his success. Every building he designs, every promotion he earns, that's his way of saying thank you to me. Some mothers get regular visits and phone calls. I get the satisfaction of knowing my son is out there using his God-given talents." The words hit Robert with unexpected force, reshaping yet again his understanding of his relationship with his mother. Had she really seen his ambition not as abandonment but as gratitude? Had his success brought her joy rather than loneliness? Later that night, after everyone had gone and the new pavilion stood silent under a blanket of stars, Robert sat alone on one of the benches. From his pocket, he pulled out his phone and, one last time, played his mother's final voicemail. As her voice filled the quiet night air, Robert closed his eyes and simply listened, not just to her words this time, but to the love behind them. The pride. The acceptance. The understanding that had always been there, even when he hadn't recognized it. "Please don't blame yourself for anything. You were the best thing in my life. Always remember that. I'm so proud of the man you've become. I love you, sweetheart." When the message ended, Robert didn't immediately replay it as he had so many times before. Instead, he took a deep breath and, with trembling fingers, pressed the delete button. It was time. Not to erase her memory, never that, but to stop living in that moment of regret. To accept that her love had been unconditional, her pride in him genuine, her understanding deeper than he had realized. As the phone confirmed the deletion, Robert felt not loss but release. The voicemail had served its purpose, guiding him home in more ways than one, back to this town, back to a life with meaning, back to an understanding of love that transcended distance and even death. Standing up, Robert took one last look at the pavilion silhouetted against the night sky, his tribute to his mother, his gift to her community. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new challenges. The senior housing development was breaking ground next month. 3 families had hired him to design homes. The library was consulting him about renovations. But tonight, in this quiet moment between what had been and what would be, Robert simply whispered, "I love you too, Mom. And I'm listening now." A soft breeze stirred the wind chimes, their gentle music drifting across the park like a response. Not her voice, but something of her spirit, present in this place he had created, in this community she had loved, in the man he had finally become. Robert smiled and began the walk home, leaving the empty bench behind but carrying her with him in all the ways that mattered.